Today, believe it or not, is the last day of this padlock series. I'm going to be doing all the final fitting and adjusting and actually closing the whole thing up. The first thing that I need to do today is pin the spring in place so it doesn't move around. To find the location for the pin, I have the spring locked into the bolt in the notch that I've already carved into the bolt, and the bolt is slid all the way to the right. And here I'm using a transfer punch to locate the pin on the back plate. This is the center punch mark that was left by the transfer punch, and you can see in the top left corner of the lock I've also center punched the location for the shackle. I'll be drilling that out at the same time. I made the pin for the spring on a lathe. I just turned the rivet down to a diameter that matched the drill size that I had. You can file this as well. It really doesn't have to be that accurate. I've also taken the time to set the tension of this spring by filing the top surface with a half-round file. Setting the tension is purely trial and error. You just keep working the key through the lock until the spring gets lifted easily. You just keep filing away very slight amounts, testing it, filing and testing, just back and forth. Here I'm using a raised block so I can isolate the pin for the spring. I don't want to damage any of the other pins that still need to be riveted in place. When I've completed the entire lock, I'll be grinding down these rivet heads so they're a lot less noticeable. Also, I'm going to be allowing this lock to rust slightly, and that'll blend everything in as well. Now that the spring is pinned in place, I can move the bolt all the way to the other side of the lock and determine where I need to file another notch in the bolt. And this notch is to keep the bolt in a locked position. If you didn't have a notch there, you could accidentally bump this padlock and the bolt would open and unlock the lock. So with the bolt in position, I'm just going to be using a Sharpie and mark the location directly on the bolt. And then I'll take it over to the vise and file a notch at that location. The next thing that I need to do is mark the location of the square hole that I need at the end of the shackle. This square hole allows the bolt to pass through the shackle and keep the shackle locked in place. I'm also going to make any adjustments that I need here to make sure that the shackle slides easily in and out of the lock. So once I have the location marked, it's just a matter of drilling out the waste material and using a chisel to square up the hole the same way I've done everything else. I've also made sure that the pivot end of the shackle is ground down to fit inside of the case. You don't want to leave it too wide because then when you rivet the shackle down, it's going to jam in place and it won't be able to move. So it has to be just a little bit thinner than that opening. The last thing that I need to do is to rivet in a guide pin on the end of the bolt. The rear guide for this lock is open, so I was able to remove the bolt and make any adjustments and reinsert it into the lock. So what this pin is going to do is ride up against the surface of the cover plate and keep that back end of the bolt from shifting out of position. So it has to be just the right length. It has to be short enough to slide easily underneath the cover without causing any problems, but not be so loose that it'll allow it to jump out of position in the rear guide. Because once it's out, there's no way of reassembling it without dismantling the lock. Now, when I built this lock, I filed in square notches because historically that's how they would have been made. They wanted to have the security feature of not having the bolt slide out of position accidentally. But today these locks are purely decorative, so what I normally do is I don't file in square notches like this. I will file in a very slight depression with a rat tail file. That way, if you ever need to open this lock, you can put just about anything inside of it and slide the bolt out of position. You don't actually need to lift the tumbler to release the bolt. It just makes it a lot easier if you misplace the key temporarily. So here I'm doing the final testing. Any adjustments have to be made now. Once the cover is riveted on, you have to totally dismantle the lock to make any changes, and that is really hard to do without totally wrecking everything. So I'm using a scrap piece of metal to simulate where the cover plate is going to be so that I can see whether the guide pin for the bolt needs to be adjusted or if it's too loose and I need to replace the pin. Again, I'm testing everything, making sure that everything's working well. I've also sprayed the inside with a lot of liquid wrench, which is basically just a silicone lubricant. It doesn't dry oily, and it leaves a good film on the surface, and it also helps to prevent rust somewhat. The pivot pin for the shackle was also turned on a lathe. The larger diameter fits inside of the hinge area snugly, and the total length is just a little bit wider than the width of the shackle. That way you can rivet the back and cover plate down onto the pivot pin without squeezing the hinge area of the shackle. Again, you can file this if you don't have a lathe. The actual pins that are getting riveted down don't need to be that accurate. They just have to fit inside of a drill hole that you have. This is the cover plate. You'll remember that I had to repair a hole just above the keyhole. Well, I've ground that flat to the surface and I've stuck it back in the fire to even out the texture of the whole plate. So the only thing left to do now is to rivet the whole thing together. You'll notice that I'm riveting the cover plate down with the key in the lock, and that's just a simple way of making sure that the cover plate isn't getting out of alignment. So I'm setting the rivet down slightly, and then I'll turn the key to make sure that it still turns freely, and then I'll continue riveting everything down. And of course, once everything's locked in place, it's always a bit of a tense moment when you turn the key for the first time to see whether the lock is actually going to work. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you're interested in supporting this channel, the simplest way, of course, is to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have questions and you want to contact me directly, you can do so by emailing me at either one of the addresses that I have listed here. It may take me a couple of days, but I will get back to you. Of course, financial support is always welcome. The only product that I produce is the information contained in these free videos. So if you like the work that I'm doing and the videos that I'm putting out, and you can spare a couple of dollars a month, consider becoming a patron by clicking the orange Patreon logo at the bottom of the screen. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.